Good afternoon. My name is David Johnson, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Nevada, Reno. The title of our event today is Why Scientists Need to Talk About Religion to Address Race and Gender Disparities in Science. This event is co-sponsored with the American Association for the Advancement of Science Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Before we begin, I want to thank Jennifer Wiseman, Katie Hinman, and Lila Barrett-Sloan at the AAAS for their willingness to partner with Rice University on today's event. Bethany Boucher at Rice University also deserves our thanks for her behind-the-scenes leadership leading up to today. And our thanks today especially goes to all of you participating. Please understand that we do not take the gift of your time lightly, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, increased concerns about structural racism, and other challenges that we face as a country. Here's how today's event is going to go. I'm going to start by setting the context for our discussion. Then Brandon Vaidyanathan, who's Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology at Catholic University of America, will walk us through an overview of the findings from the Religion Among Scientists in International Context study. The next speaker will be Elaine Howard-Eklund, who is the principal investigator of this study and the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences at Rice University. And she's going to discuss what some of our key findings might mean for addressing race and gender inequities in science. You can find out more about this study in our book, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, written with our colleagues Kirsten Matthews, Stephen Lewis, Robert Thompson, and D.D. And after remarks by Brandon and Elaine, there'll be time dedicated for questions from the audience. We wish we could be with you in person, but here's how we're going to make this work online. All participants will be muted and videos disabled. The chat feature will also be disabled, but you'll be able to submit questions throughout the conference, and we encourage you to do so via the Zoom Q&A function. To do so, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and this will open a new window where you can type your questions. Please note that our team will be dismissing all questions as they are submitted. Don't take offense at this. This is simply how we're going to confirm that we've received your question, and after it's dismissed, your question will go into a pool of all submitted questions for consideration. If you'd like, you can include your name and affiliation when submitting your question, and we will read this information along with your question. And now to today's focus. Science and religion are two of the most influential institutions across the globe. Religion is enormously significant in the global sphere. 5.8 billion individuals, which represents nearly 85% of the global population, are religious. Science is significant. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that in 2015, the global science and engineering workforce in OECD countries was 4.8 million. Any nation that is growing economically is trying to grow its science and technology infrastructure. And whether we like it or not, it's a social reality that the science and faith interface lives large in the public imagination around the world. Given that nations vary greatly in terms of their religious composition and their scientific characteristics, it's imperative that we study science and religion in international comparative contexts, and not just by focusing on countries like the US or the West more broadly. We need only turn to the UK, where Richard Dawkins, the former University of Oxford's professor for the public understanding of science, argues in front of an audience of millions through his New York Times best-selling book, The God Delusion, and also on Twitter, that religion and science are not ever compatible. Meanwhile, Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health and a leading voice in the fight against COVID-19, tries to convince his readers that science is completely compatible with his own Christian faith. And these debates are found not just in the lives of individual scientists, they make their way into the public sphere. So here in the United States, for example, we've seen debates about whether or not creationism should be taught alongside evolution. We see religious concerns about the use of stem cells in research. And it's not difficult to find other such examples in the United States, nor is it difficult to find such examples in other regions across the globe. And we know that what individuals think about science and religion is consequential for a host of other social issues, such as who an individual votes for, and by consequence, the public financial support for scientific research. Whether a parent encourages their child to take science classes, whether a Black or Hispanic Christian trusts scientists, whether an underrepresented minority student thinks a science career is even an option, and as we've all seen most recently, what people think about science and religion influences how we respond to a pandemic. But what's less apparent, however, is what scientists in the United States and other regions across the globe actually think about religion and how these views might inform other social issues such as diversity in science. But before we can start discussing religion as a missing dimension for diversity in science, we need to understand the place of religion in science more broadly. In other words, some of you out there might see religion as having no place in science, so we want to convince you, using data that we collected from scientists around the world, that religion is indeed there, and it's often relevant to scientific work and to the issue of diversity. So accordingly, over the course of our talk today, we're going to make 6 big picture points. First, around the world, there are many more religious scientists than we typically think. We also find that atheist scientists are much more varied than the most vocal atheists that we see in the public sphere. We also find that most scientists do not see religion and science as in conflict with one another, even in the most secular contexts like the United Kingdom and France. Religion comes up in a multitude of ways in the scientific workplace. And we want to consider how religion might be a part of increasing racial and gender diversity, and then consider how scientific and religious communities might work together to increase diversity in science. And now I'm going to transition to my friend and colleague, Brandon Vaidyanathan, who will provide an overview of the methods of the RASIC Research Initiative and walk us through the first 3 points that I just described.
Thank you, Dave. Let me say a little bit first about the methods that we used in our study. So we examined 8 national contexts. We studied France, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, United Kingdom, the United States. And these are contexts with very different levels of scientific infrastructure, very different religious traditions, very different degrees of religiosity. And in these contexts, we focused on 2 disciplines, biology and physics. These are disciplines with very different intersections with religion, disciplines that delve deeply into the origins of humanity and of the universe. These are also disciplines with very different proportions of women. We know that gender is often connected to religious belief and practice, with women in the general population being more religious than men. So we compiled a sampling frame or a massive list of 61,020 biologists and physicists who were eligible for our survey. And then we took a random sample of 22,525 scientists to whom we sent our web survey. In total, 9,422 biologists and physicists responded to our survey. Surveys box people in. You're forced to choose your answers to questions from options that were developed by researchers. But religion is not something that is ever fully understood by researcher-created categories. And so, to gain a better understanding of religion among scientists, we got on planes and Skype and the phone and conducted 609 in-depth interviews with scientists in these contexts. So the first big point we want to make is that in each of the national contexts we studied, there are more religious scientists than we might think. And this point is consequential for diversity in science. See, religion is connected to other social factors like gender and race and national origin. And if the science community is perceived as hostile to religion, it may also cut off people who feel marginalized not because of their religion, but also because of their race and gender. So I want to talk a little bit about the proportion of religious scientists in these different contexts. Sociologists conceptualize religion in many different ways. And here we start by simply asking biologists and physicists if they see themselves as religious. And we'll compare the proportion of scientists that identify as religious to the proportion in the general population. This is important to consider because the nations with the biggest disparities in religiosity between scientists and the general public might have a harder time with dialogue between scientific and religious communities. So in France, the UK, the US, and Hong Kong, between 16 to 39% of scientists see themselves as religious. Nothing to write home about, but it's still a significant minority. Now look at this. When we move to Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India, we see that more than 50% of scientists see themselves as religious. But still, scientists might be much less religious than the general population in their given regional context. And we do see that sometimes this is definitely the case. Scientists are indeed sometimes less religious than the members of a given general population. The gap is widest in France, where the general public is about 3 times more likely to identify as religious compared to scientists, followed by the US and the UK. The gaps are more moderate in Italy and Turkey. But now when we look to Hong Kong and Taiwan, the gaps actually reverse. A significantly greater proportion of scientists considers themselves religious when compared to the general population. This is a finding we did not expect. So in sum, even in the US, there are more religious scientists than we might think. So religious people need not select out of a science career on the erroneous belief that all scientists are atheists. In fact, there's quite a bit of variation even when we look at atheists. We have this popular conception, perhaps because the new atheists like Richard Dawkins have been so vocal, that there is only one way to be an atheist, and that is to be vehemently against religion. But when we studied atheist scientists, that's not what we found. There's considerable variation across the national context we studied in the proportion of scientists who are convinced atheists. There are also important national variations in the differences between scientists and the general population when it comes to atheism. We see large magnitudes of difference in France, the UK, the US, Italy, and Turkey, but the direction is actually reversed again in Hong Kong and Taiwan. We identified several different kinds of atheist scientists in our research as well, and here I'll point out just 3. First is what we call the modernist atheists. Those who are convinced that there is no God and have absolutely no participation in any religious organization. We found that even these atheist scientists do not agree with Richard Dawkins. They think religion has the potential to be helpful to society under certain conditions. For example, one UK biologist said, "So if religion is moderate and if it's intelligent and conscious, then I think it is very beneficial. If it's irrational and hysterical and dogmatic, then I think it can be very dangerous. It can block science." The second type is what we call spiritual atheists. During our interviews with atheist scientists, many of them talked about seeing their work as exploring the mysteries of the natural world or the cosmos as being spiritual in some way. So as one US physicist told us, the spirituality part of it is why you do the work. I mean, I'm interested in understanding how the universe began, possibly what its long-term future is going to be. I think those are certainly spiritual questions. Another UK biologist said, "I think my definition of spirituality is fairly nebulous. The goal of my work is service to humanity, to impart a sense of wonder." And so that's sort of all part of my worldview that encompasses spirituality as well. And finally, perhaps most apt to break some of the public stereotypes that atheist scientists are all against religious people, we found that there are atheist scientists who actively participate in religious organizations. According to this UK reader in physics, "I have no problem going to church services. It's like looking at another part of your culture. But I have no faith religiously. It doesn't worry me that religion is still out there." All atheist scientists are not the same. Our research shows that there is considerable diversity in the types of atheisms that they profess, meaning the anti-religious messages religious women and minorities may hear in the public sphere do not reflect what most non-religious scientists actually think about religion. You'll be able to read more about this topic in Elaine Howard Eklund and David Johnson's forthcoming book, Varieties of Atheism in Science. Our third big point is that most scientists do not think there is a conflict between religion and science. This is connected to diversity because if most scientists embrace the conflict view, then women and minorities who are more likely to be religious would encounter a workplace hostile to their identities and experiences. But scientists are not as hostile to religion as we are led to think. We asked scientists on our survey to respond to a question describing the relationship between religion and science. whether they saw it as one of conflict, independence, or collaboration. The dominant view for scientists in these 8 nations and regions is that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality, echoing the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria. Here's what this view of independence looks like through the narrative of an Italian physicist. No, there is no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there is no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or non-existence of God. Again, there is no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. God is outside the reach and the limits of science. There is indeed a minority of scientists in each national context who view science and religion as being in conflict, especially in France, the UK, and the US. But there is also a strong minority, especially in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, that view science and religion as having the ability to collaborate. Here's what this collaboration view looks like. So as one US biology graduate student said, "For me personally, I don't experience a conflict. My religious side guides my hope for my professional work, and my professional work guides my openness to my religion." So our research shows that the popular idea that science and religion are in conflict is simply not true for the vast majority of scientists. Now my colleague Elaine Howard-Eklund will say more about how religion comes up in the scientific workplace.
Thank you again so much, listeners, for joining us. I want to say before I start my section that I really wish we could be together. I had so looked forward to being at the AAAS in DC, to connecting with my friends there, and also with each of you in person. But it's my hope that the fact that we're doing this conference, this webinar virtually, really allows us to have more people come, and a wider variety of people than we might if we'd had it in person. And so there's a kind of redemption in that as well. Our fourth big point is that religion comes up in the scientific workplace, even for those scientists who are not personally religious. Religion in the scientific workplace is connected to diversity because how scientists respond to religion when it comes up may shape whether the scientific workplace is experienced as welcoming or hostile. We find that especially in nations where there is a large proportion of foreign-born scientists, that immigrants often bring their religious traditions with them. And religious immigrants are part of what makes US science diverse. In some regional contexts, especially when the public is more religious than scientists are, scientists then need to interface with a religious public. And scientists, even those who are not religious, often draw on forms of religion-based ethics to understand the ethical implications of their scientific work. Here I'm going to focus primarily on the first 2 ways. A significant minority of the global scientific workforce is living outside of their home nation. They bring their religious traditions with them, of course, when they move to practice science in a nation outside their own. Hindus and Buddhists, for example, enter US science, Muslims enter UK and French science in larger numbers than those religious traditions are present in the general population. And they bring changes with them. In Islam, for example, symbols of faith can be more apparent, especially for women when compared to Christian symbols of faith. A cross can be worn under a shirt, and under certain conditions, such overt symbols may lead to forms of perceived discrimination. Here's an interview with a French physicist that I did. He said this: "I had an interview with a Muslim girl who wants to apply to come here. So I did an interview with her through Skype, but then I could see that she was Muslim because she had the veil. We had a lab meeting, and then I said, okay, I interviewed this woman and stuff. She seems okay. And then I brought up the issue that she was a Muslim with a veil. Some colleagues didn't want that in the lab. They think it will interfere with their work." Faith can also shape how scientists interface with the public. When the public brings religiously based challenges to scientific research and ideas such as evolution or embryonic stem cell research. This is especially salient when scientists work in the midst of a public that is more religious than they are. We see conditions under which scientists need the public for funding approval and even for doing experiments involving human subjects. Here's a quote from a biologist in the UK who said this: "I work with food, And sometimes the research work would involve tasting or analyzing samples that may not be compatible with everyone's religious background. So if I knew that a number of my participants would prefer halal meat because that is what their religion sort of suggests, we would try to source halal and be clean about it, or we would offer the choice not to participate if they feel that the samples are not compatible with their religious views. It seems that under certain conditions, religion does enter science. At this point, we've painted a picture of religion and science and highlighted how these conditions are relevant to diversity. Now we want to drill down a bit and look more specifically at the intersection of religion and other kinds of diversity in science. Our fifth big point is this. In the US, a thoughtful approach to religion within the scientific community may be part of increasing gender and racial diversity in science. To take a step back, I hope we don't have to spend further time convincing you that race and gender access and inequity in science is a problem for science. By first admitting that science has been part of the problem in the widening gap in equality, we can start to understand what we must do to start addressing the problem, says Marcia McNutt, president of the National Academy of Sciences. And Rita Colwell, former director of the National Science Foundation, says that as our national workforce becomes increasingly diverse, a scientific enterprise with mainly white male faces risks sending the signal that others are not welcome. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has responded to this, has sponsored initiatives and written editorials to encourage reflection on and programming to address the lack of diversity in science, and some of these are listed on the slide we put up here. From our own data of biologists and physicists of all ranks working at US research universities and institutes, we see that women, who account for a little over 50% of the US population, account for roughly 39% of biologists and 17% of physicists in our sample. It's also important to take note of this, that these numbers pool all graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, researchers, and faculty. So the diversity is actually much worse of a problem when we enter, the lack of diversity is much worse when we enter the higher ranks of faculty positions at research universities. And when we look at the proportion of Black and Hispanic individuals, the numbers appear even more stark. We see that 2% of our biologists are Black and less than 1% of our physicists, and about 5% of our biologists are Hispanic and 2% of our physicists are Hispanic. It's worth pointing out too that while Asians appear actually to be quite overrepresented in our population, that much of this is to do with the international flow of scientists from East and South Asia to the US, and that actually US-born Asian Americans from some groups are also underrepresented in research science careers. Another perspective worth considering is the representation of religious individuals in science. Scientists in the US are less likely to be religious than members of the US public, especially those who work at US universities. This difference is especially pronounced among those who are Christians, where there are about twice more Christians, if we include Catholics and Protestants, in the general population than in the science community. And there are almost twice more non-religious people in the science community than the general population. We are putting little blue boxes around things to draw your attention to them. Why is it worth considering representation of religious individuals in science? The US public, we argue, the main pool of talent for the science and engineering workforce is highly religious. About 70% of Americans have a religious affiliation. And survey data shows, our own and others, that religious individuals are no different than non-religious individuals in their knowledge of and interest in science. They do, however, tend to have lower trust in scientists and in the science community. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. And perhaps most importantly for our concerns here, Black and Hispanic Americans and women of all racial groups tend to be more religious when compared to white men. Let's zero in on gender for a moment. When we turn to the science fields we studied, all subfields of biology and all subfields of physics, we see that a higher proportion of women in biology, 36%, see themselves as religious when compared to men in biology at 28%. But in physics, about the same proportion of men and women see themselves as religious. On the next slide, we compare our scientists to the general population in terms of religious affiliation. I want to draw your attention to Christian women in particular, where 23% of the US population is comprised of Christian women, compared to 7% of the scientists at universities and research institutes we studied. I didn't put this on the slide, but when we look at other ways of measuring religion in the general population, we see that Christian women in particular are a good deal more religious than Christian men. For example, more than 7 in 10 US Christian women say religion is very important in their lives, compared with 62% of the nation's Christian men. And roughly 3/4 of Christian women say that they pray at least daily, compared with about 60% of Christian men. So then one potential reason for the underrepresentation of women in science, among many reasons, is that Christian women in particular may be self-selecting out of science. A piece of this puzzle may be parenting. Religious women are somewhat more likely to have children. Perhaps Christian women perceive that high-level research science careers are not friendly to parenting. We do see that among the scientists we studied, 39% of religious women scientists have children, compared to 55% of religious men scientists. Scientists in general have fewer children than those in the general population, and scientists generally perceive the science career pushes them to have fewer children than they might have wanted. I've written about this elsewhere. The desire to have families may be then one thing that keeps religious women from entering science, while this may not be perceived of as much of an impediment for men. But if we compare science overall to the US population, as these figures about Christian women seem to be doing, we can point out that not only are they underrepresented, they are also likely to report discrimination of various forms. It's worth repeating that Christian women are particularly underrepresented in science, accounting for only 7% of scientists participating in our study. 88% of Christian women scientists report having been discriminated against in the context of their work, including 26% because of their religion and 69% because of their gender. Now we turn to looking at race and religion together among scientists. Something a little different emerges here than when looking at gender. Here we see that among Black Americans broadly, 79% are affiliated with a Christian tradition. And the proportion is quite high for Black US scientists as well, where 64% of Black scientists are affiliated with a Christian tradition and 15% are part of another religion. When we look just at the science community in the next slide with a little bit more religious detail, we see that a greater proportion of Black scientists are Protestant Christians at 45% when compared to white scientists who are Protestant Christians at 13%. And a much smaller proportion of Black scientists are not religious at a mere 21% when compared to white scientists who are not religious at 60%. For Hispanic scientists, about the same proportion are non-religious as white scientists at 60%, but a higher proportion of Hispanic scientists are Catholic at 23% when compared to white scientists who are Catholic at 13%. Our focus this afternoon has been on scientists, and I've given you a lot of numbers, but as we close and go into our next point, it's worth considering other data that we've collected on how racial minorities view science. And some of the other research we're doing through the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University, we're examining how religious people, particularly Black and Hispanic religious groups, respond to science and scientists. We're doing surveys and interviews with leaders of largely Black and Hispanic congregations, as well as the people in those congregations, to see how they view science. Here's an interview from a pastor of a largely Black church who says this: a lot of what attracts people is seeing people that look like them. And so we don't see a lot of scientists who look like us or believe like us. And this from a man we interviewed in a Hispanic congregation who said Hispanics look at science as more of an Anglo field, so that their biggest fear is to step into that realm because they might be discriminated against, they might be looked down upon. We see in our broader research then that religious organizations in Black and Hispanic communities are sites actually where education is really fostered for children. Many of the congregations that we studied have really robust after-school programs for children, for example. But they're not always places where science and scientists are trusted. A pastor of a largely Black church says this: I think trust is major for a lot of African American churches. When you talk about going into a context like science, we ask, what are you all doing with our kids? What is the outcome of this? What's really going to happen? Because we have been used to produce certain things like science experiments that were not in our favor, we've been taken advantage of. Come to me with a nice package and a presentation, but really there's an ulterior motive. And another pastor of a Black church says this: science still for a lot of African Americans is a no trespassing zone. If you want to read more about some of these particular findings, we put up some of our articles from these other projects here for you. Our sixth big point is this: that there is a possibility that scientific and religious communities might work together for the sake of increasing diversity in science. Part of the onus is on faith communities themselves, especially Christian faith communities. They have often been portrayed by the media and others as being anti-science and anti-scientists, and sometimes indeed they have been. And yet, by paying attention only to this as the dominant narrative, we miss the possibilities, as explained by this woman we interviewed, who's a physicist at a top research university, who says this: I grew up with the notion that you shouldn't be afraid of knowledge. I learned this both in religion and from science. Here are some practical implications of what we've just talked about. One possibility is that religious communities need to be more careful when it comes to gender inclusion of all the implicit ways they discourage women from careers in general, but in particular discourage women from pursuing science. One woman scientist we interviewed who attended church told me this. She said, I was always more affirmed for my mothering, especially because my daughter behaved so well, than I was for being a scientist, even though she was a scientist at the major university in her city. And nonprofit organizations that focus on increasing the dialogue and cooperation between religious and scientific communities need to make sure too that women's voices are part of and even lead such conversations. And we have great examples of this through the AAAS's own Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program. And from what we are finding though, if scientific communities, I know many of you on this call are part of the science community, if scientific communities reflect on all the ways they might foster family-friendly work environments, that may, by implication, encourage more religious women to enter science and increase the gender diversity in science overall. We also need to start thinking about what it would look like for scientists to start doing outreach to youth through Black and Hispanic religious communities, particularly Black and Hispanic scientists who are themselves persons of faith. This pastor from a Black church says this: we would be happy to have a scientist who is a Christian visit our church to talk about majoring in science for our college-bound seniors. And as one of our respondents said again, it's important to see someone who looks like me and hear someone who believes like me. We often, in the scientific community, broadly frame religion as a problem for science. But especially in Black and Hispanic communities, religious organizations, which are often civic organizations that encourage education among youth, might just hold some possibilities for science. Thank you so much.
And I'm going to start with the first question. Elaine, can you hear me?
I can,
Okay,
yes.
here we go.
We are
Sorry about
ready
that.
to go with these great questions. It was really hard for me not to look down at the question and answer while I was talking. So thanks, folks. Please keep putting those questions in.
All right, so this question comes from a physicist who writes, some years ago, there was a speech given at the annual AAAS meeting in which the comment, and here I'm going to quote it, historical examples show that faith-based communities do have the power to turn off science, was made. And here's the question. In many ways, the current conditions in the US surrounding the position of the faith community in opposition to the scientific community's recommendations regarding mitigation of the COVID-19 virus can be regarded as an example of this phenomenon. Do you agree? So once again, does the faith community's position in opposition to science as it relates to COVID-19, is this an example of the faith community turning off science?
Is it okay if I take that one, Brandon?
Sure, you could. Yeah, once you get started.
Yeah.
After, yeah.
That's a great question. So, and thanks so much, Professor Gates, for asking it. We do see examples of that. So we see very popular media examples of large churches in particular refusing to close. I will say that at Rice University, we've been doing a small study of Houston communities. We've been tracking about 350 religious communities and faith-based nonprofits in Houston. And we find that by and large, the majority of them, really well over 95% of the communities that we've been tracking, have followed best practices during COVID-19, closing when they need to be closed, practicing social distance. And so I think we have some evidence that by and large, it's an anomaly for faith communities as organizations not to follow the best scientific practices related to COVID. I think there's something else underneath that question, which is really important to address, and is that faith communities have a lot of power in people's lives for those who are a part of them. And so that's why it's not popular among some, but I think it's really important to consider the ways in which scientific and faith communities might actually partner around really, really important social issues, because other research shows that religious people do know as much science. They're as likely to get college degrees as other groups of people, as non-religious people in the general population. So there is actually a real trust in science itself. There's not as much sometimes of a trust in scientists, and you saw this in some of the data we presented, a kind of suspicion of scientists.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, I mean, I don't know if there was any kind of uniform response of the faith community, as it's not a homogeneous block, right? There are variations. And there's ongoing research. I'm doing a bit of research in the Washington, D.C. area as well, looking at a number of faith communities and how they're interpreting and responding to the pandemic. And there's an important recent article that came out by John Evans and Esther Hargitay, which looks at the US population's trust in scientists around COVID-19, and they find some interesting differences among faith communities in particular. And just to quote just a couple of sentences, their model finds that Catholics and conservative Protestants are less likely than the non-religious to think that scientists understand COVID-19. And their speculation is that because there's no religious counterclaim regarding infectious disease in either tradition, they think these findings represent a direct Trump communication effect. As these are the two religious groups in the US who have up till now been Trump's greatest supporters. So I think we need to think about the role of politics and the intersection of politics and religion here in shaping trust in scientists.
That's excellent.
I was going to make the same point, Brandon, so thank you for doing it for me. Here's one that I think is an important question that I will throw to the two of you. And this comes from a participant today who asks, can you expand on what criteria is used to designate a scientist in these surveys and how that criteria might impact these findings? So just what the heck are we talking about when we say we interviewed and surveyed scientists, and how did our categorization of that influence what we found? Brandon, would you like to take the first crack at that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. We're really looking at primarily research scientists, academic scientists, so scientists who are in two disciplines, physics and biology, located largely at universities or research centers or colleges. We're not looking at medical scientists who doing medical research. We're not looking at engineers. We're not looking at a wide variety of people who work in the sciences. We're not looking at folks working in industry. And so one could speculate that perhaps in some other domains of science outside the academic context, religiosity might look different. It is possible that scientists who are in university or of a different kind of persuasion when it comes to religion in particular, and the kind of culture that develops in academia around their views of religion is different from what you would find among scientists working in, large firms or medical professionals. I think you would find some differences there.
And what I would add to that point, we could have even focused on social scientists, right, if we wanted to truly broaden what we mean by scientists and look at sociologists, economists, and political scientists and psychologists. And that work, that is some work that's been done by Elaine and Chris Scheidel, looking at the top 20 research universities in the United States. But the reason that we focus on biology and physics in particular is because they are core science disciplines, and they have a history of having some sort of tension with religious epistemologies. And here what I would also discuss is that if we had focused on a subfield of either one of these disciplines, for example, if we had only surveyed evolutionary biologists or cosmologists, we might have found different results, because explanations of human origins and the explanations of the origins of the universe are quite frequently the place where one finds tension between science and religion. And so had we focused specifically on a field like that, we might have found even more presence of a conflict narrative. But for many biologists, for example, who don't work in the field of evolutionary biology, when they're not religious, they often see religion as simply irrelevant and isn't a basis of conflict because it doesn't come up in their day-to-day work. Elaine, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, we're gonna make our responses go a little bit faster because we see we have about 30 more questions here. The book David alluded to that I wrote with Christopher Scheidel, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. And there we included a subsample of scientists who work in research and development in corporations, medical scientists, and those outside of research universities. Universities are particular kinds of entities where the scientific population does tend to be less religious than the general public.
I will try and move us along more quickly with the questions. Let's go with a question from Marcia McNutt, who asks, the National Academy of Science has taken the position that it is not constructive to pitch science and religion against one another. There are many questions that science can answer, but others it cannot. Is there any indication that having some belief in a higher power makes someone a more moral and ethical person?
I'm really honored that Marcia McNutt asked us a question. Thank you. Thank you for that, especially since we quoted you in the talk. This is not the kind of question that a sociologist can answer. This question is, I hate to punt to my philosopher and theologian colleagues, but this is not. So what we can say is David and I have done some work on this particular topic, and Brandon and I have done some work on this particular topic. Religious scientists do sometimes think they're more moral or think they use their religiously based ethics in a particular kind of way to have an impact on their science. Brandon, did you want to pick up on anything else?
Well, it's a challenging thing to figure out how one would measure the morality of a scientist, right? I mean, I think it's an interesting thought experiment to figure out, like, how would we then actually measure it and study it? Religious people are capable of all kinds of immoral acts, but religion is also a motivating force for moral action. And I think there are other non-religious moral sources in our culture that scientists draw on. So it's, I think, both theoretically and empirically a very challenging question. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it, but it would be an interesting project that would require, I think, a lot more heads than ours.
The 2 cents that I would add is that we did have a couple of questions about values on the survey in terms of wanting power or wanting it's important to be treated differently or equally than other people. And effectively what we found is that there's no difference between religious and non-religious scientists across the sort of moral orientations that we included in our survey. And I'd be happy to share that information with anybody who wants to contact our team. It's also noted in Elaine and I's forthcoming book on varieties of atheism in science, because this is definitely the type of question that comes up, especially when we're talking about religion versus irreligion and secularity. And here's another question that we frequently get that I will pose to Elaine and Brandon. And this is from an anonymous participant. Why are Hong Kong and Taiwan different from the other countries in terms of religious scientists?
This is very cool. When you survey and interview scientists, you can ask them your research questions. So we found this in our survey. And then when we did our interviews, we actually followed up with Taiwanese and Hong Kongese scientists and said, like, we're finding these kind of interesting results. What do you think about this? For Hong Kong, folks said, and this is up to you whether or not you think this is the case, but folks in Hong Kong said that there is a real history in particular of a Catholic presence in Hong Kong and in the best education institutions in Hong Kong. And so there's almost what one Hong Kong scientist said to us, a kind of Christian mafia in science there, where there's like a flow for scientists through these educational institutions into top research universities. Taiwan is a different kind of space. I've written some about this with Dee, who is a former PhD student with me and now professor at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. Hong Kong is, Taiwan rather, is a very religiously diverse national context and has a kind of pluralism related to religion where there's not the kind of rifts between science and faith that there is, say, in some of the nations which are more Christian dominant. And so there's a lot that's been written about that, but that's a really good question.
I'll go to another question from Veronica, and this is a good one because earlier we got the question of what do we mean by scientist, and Veronica asks, is there space for non-theistic religions like Buddhism, my own religion, in this research? I would describe myself as religious, but also atheist. So what do sociologists mean when we're talking about religion, and how do we measure that?
Brandon, I'll let you take that.
Sure, yeah, there's plenty of ink that's been spilled on this question. I guess, there are, there are a variety of ways in which you can measure what it means to be religious. And so we've used a couple of different measures in our presentation here. One of them is religious affiliation. So whether people recognize themselves as belonging to some kind of faith tradition, so Buddhist would be one category among others. And then there's, of course, belief in God, which is implied in your question, right? And so that is another measure of a certain kind of religiosity. Another measure we used here as well was people's self-identification. Do you consider yourself a religious person? Another one I think that was also used in our presentation was how important is religion in your life? And we allow people a variety of, not at all important to the most important thing in my life. So on those various measures, someone who's an atheist would answer probably very differently on some of those questions, right? So it's possible to be an atheist and a Buddhist and someone who takes religion very seriously and doesn't believe in God. And so I think all of those can intersect at the same time. And depending on what survey measure we use, we can get at different aspects of those data. So yes, there is room for the sort of perspective that you hold, and there are ways to measure how many scientists fit into that.
And what I would add is when you analyze US atheist scientists, the biologists and physicists, roughly 21% of them do not believe in God, but identify with a specific religious tradition, such as Protestantism, but also with Buddhism and other forms of religion. Now I'm going to go to another question that I will throw to the two of you. How do you think the changing immigration policies in the United States, for example, may change the religious landscape in the scientific community in the US?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Of course, in these absolutely crazy times, no one knows exactly what's going to happen. But if we cut down our international flow of scientists through our international policy, we may see a lessening of religious diversity in science. So the national contexts where scientists are flowing from to the US are largely contexts where they may bring increasing numbers of Buddhists and Muslims in particular, and increasing numbers of non-religious people. So many of the international scientists that we surveyed in our survey are actually non-religious. So there's a kind of diversity which may be decreased in terms of religiosity if we shunt our international flow of scientists to some extent.
All right. So I will go to another question in the name of trying to be as inclusive as possible as we wind down with about the 8 minutes remaining that we have. And this one's from an evolutionary biologist named Sarah about what contributes to misperceptions that people have. And she writes, the 4 claims of the book and related 6 claims of the talk run counter to expectations, both of scientists and of the public. From what you all have seen in your work, what are a few factors that contribute most to these misconceptions persisting despite the evidence to the contrary? So why do we have these misperceptions and where do they come from?
That's a hard one to answer, Sarah, but we have done studies both of the scientific community and what scientists think about religion in several different national contexts that we presented here, but also in our other work, we have done research on what religious people think about science. And so if you put those 2 studies together, those sets of studies, we do find that people seem to be influenced by very public writing from the collective of writers who call themselves the New Atheists. And so these are folks who are not necessarily representative of scientists as a whole, but because they write so much, it feels to the general public like there are a lot more scientists like them than there really are. So in an article I did with Chris Scheidel in the Public Understanding of Science, we asked everyday people to what extent they thought scientists were like someone like Richard Dawkins versus like someone like Francis Collins, who is a pretty outspoken Christian, as many of you know, is current director of the National Institutes of Health. And they were much more likely to think that all scientists were more like Dawkins. Even if they didn't know who Dawkins was when we gave a description of him, they thought that this was very typical of what scientists are, even though they thought Collins was perhaps friendlier and nicer and had other positive characteristics that went with him, they still thought Dawkins was more typical. And I think that gives us just a little bit of evidence of where some of these ideas might be coming from. And we don't have a lot of scientists in congregations who are talking openly about their scientific work, which I think could be an antidote. When we interview scientists who are part of congregations, sometimes they feel unnecessarily silenced about their scientific work within actual congregations. And so an antidote might be to have scientists who are persons of faith from various traditions talk more openly about their scientific work within congregations as well.
And what I would add to that is there's also a tendency, I recall from interviews with US scientists, to see even evangelical Christians as representative of all religious groups, when evangelical Christians themselves are not an entirely well understood group and difficult to measure. So it sort of goes both ways, and holding up one type of person is representative of the broader group. And when you focus at the extremes, there tends to be confusion about, you get a different picture than what we tend to find when we look across the spectrum of religious individuals and of scientific individuals. And we are now getting a 5-minute warning from our team, so I'll go to another question. Let me find one here. In doing outreach work to bridge the gaps between religion and science, what work could be done and would work done and progress achieved within one specific religious group, such as Catholics, directly or indirectly lead to similar progress or effects within other religious groups? Or would the outreach work need to be done for all religious groups individually? individually. So I think this is a question about how we go about trying to
Mhm.
alter perceptions, and what happens if you focus on one particular group versus working across the spectrum.
We'll discipline ourselves and have just one of us answer it so we can move on to more questions. Yeah, Brandon.
Well, I mean, I would think it would need to occur concurrently, right? I mean, I think the kinds of challenges or views of science that exist in different religious communities isn't quite the same. The tensions between science and religion that are experienced in different faith traditions aren't the same either. So evolution is a problem for some faith traditions, not others, etc. So I think those dialogues need to go on case by case basis. I think across a number of traditions. But I think it's also a matter of finding scientists from those traditions who can be bridge builders, and seeing whether, I think again AAAS Dozer is a great resource and a great hub for this kind of work.
All right, we'll move on with the speed round. And this is a question about changes in people's beliefs as a result of exposure to science. And this is from an anonymous participant who asks, did we know how people's beliefs changed as they proceeded through science education? I ask as a scientist who began physics graduate school as a Christian and graduated as an atheist. I would imagine that some beliefs about religion may change even if people retain the identity of their religious affiliation.
We have an article about that. I feel like that's my card for everything. So there's an article that I recently wrote with Dan Bolger and Robert Thompson about religious transitions among scientists. All we have is perceptions, right? So it is illegal for good reason to raise a baby in a box and then help them become a scientist and study their religion over time, right? So what we do is we have perceptions of folks' own religiosity. We ask them, what was your religion at age 16? What's your religion now after having experienced science? And we look at those transitions. Most people do not transition actually, but a significant minority do. And usually those transitions happen a bit earlier in life than graduate school, but there's other stuff that's in that article that you might want to read. Thanks for pointing that out. That's an excellent question that many people wonder about.
I want to just acknowledge that we have tons of excellent questions that we wish we had the time to address. I would strongly encourage you that if you'd like, please feel free to reach out to our team and we'd be happy to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, out of respect for your time, we need to wind down our conversation, and I will hand that to Elaine. And on behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you. Elaine?
Yeah, and I want to thank my colleagues, David and Brandon, as well. I wish we could spend a lot more time with you all. Thank you again for joining us for why scientists need to talk about religion to address race and gender disparities in science. We are really, really honored that you spent this time with us. We want you to know that we'll be distributing a copy of our PowerPoint slides to you all, as well as sending out a survey so that you might provide your thoughts in the presentation. And information about us will be on those slides. And so, as David said, you may reach out to us if you have questions that didn't get answered. We always appreciate your feedback. Once again, thank you for being with us. We do not take the gift of your time lightly. And I think in these times, it's always worth saying, be well.